Hello there, and thanks for joining me. I'm Corel Painter Master Aaron Rutten, and in this video I'm going to demonstrate some of the new features in Corel Painter 2017. One of the first things that you'll notice when you launch Corel Painter 2017 for the first time is the new welcome screen, which features new tutorials and some new artwork from Corel Painter artists, like this guy here. Next, you'll notice that the interface looks a little different. Up here at the top, there's a few extra buttons. This is the enhanced property bar, and it changes depending on the brush you have selected to give you really quick and easy access to all of the relevant features of that brush. So let's go ahead and choose a brush. Let's choose a particle brush here, Flow Fur, and you'll see that I get dab options that lets me control the tip of my brush. I also get particles, and this is a temporary flyout menu, so if I click away and I start painting, that palette goes away. So no longer do I have to keep a whole bunch of palettes on my screen if I don't want to. I also don't have to dig through the advanced brush controls or the general brush controls, which are, by the way, easily accessible right here in the enhanced property bar. So you'll notice that some things will fly out and other things will pop out into a palette. And so things that pop out into a palette, you can easily just turn on and off like so. You can see I can do that with each of these. You'll also notice that paper grain is easily accessible here as a flyout, so I can choose a paper texture. If I want a little more control than that, I can pop out the papers panel, and then I have the papers over here. I can also pop open the paper libraries, which is in that same tab. I also have control over the grain. If I want to add glow, I can add that here. And again, this will change depending on the brush you have selected. So let's choose a different kind of brush. Let's choose a real watercolor brush. And you'll notice that now the options are quite a bit different. We can dry the watercolor layer, we can pause diffusion as we had before, but now we also have quick access to the papers, and we have some options over here for the dab, and all of the real watercolor options that we can just pop open and then hide very easily. So this is a feature I really like because it really streamlines my personal painting experience by making a lot of controls easily accessible here at the top, so I don't have to hunt for them in a bunch of palettes or keep them on screen. The next new feature we'll take a look at also relates to organization, and that is the palette drawers. And you'll see that Color and Layers here has this little label at the top, this gray bar. And this is a palette drawer, meaning that I can close the drawer by double-clicking on it, or I can double-click again to open the drawer. And what's nice about that is that everything is organized into palette drawers, so my papers can be in a palette drawer. I just want to hide those easily, hide the color easily. Maybe I'll also want the particle palette. I'll open that up. That can be a palette drawer, and I can even make my own palette drawers if I want. Let's say, for example, I wanted to put this brush into a palette, and then maybe I want the real watercolor palette. Bring that over here, and I'll move that into that palette. Maybe I'll grab one more watercolor brush. Maybe this is going to be my watercolor painting palette here. If I want to make this into a palette drawer, I can click on the little gear here in the top right, and I can choose palette drawer. I can also click on that gear to rename it. And then now I can take that palette drawer, I can move it up here, and I can double click to close the drawer. Now I have all this room on my screen where I can paint without those palettes interfering. And then when I want to get to those palettes, I just open up the drawer, select a new brush or change some settings, and close the drawer again to get it out of the way. I like this feature a lot for two reasons. One is it helps me organize things together a little bit better because I have a really complicated workspace. You can see that I've done some customization. I have this custom AR palette here, which I can close up. I can close up my shortcuts. Now, I didn't make a palette drawer out of this stuff over here because I don't mind having a little bit of space to be used for palettes and stuff. But over here, I have my particle and nozzles, and I have my glazing, dab stencil, and textures, which we'll look at in a little bit. So to illustrate how this is useful to me, you can see that normally I like to paint with a lot of palettes on the screen, and in earlier versions of Painter, it was kind of necessary to have all these palettes here. But now I can close up these palette drawers if I want to, just to get all that stuff out of the way. I still know where it is because I can see the label, and I'm the kind of person who likes to be organized, so I kind of like these labels. And then I can go ahead and go in here and start painting freely and doing whatever I want to do. And now I have a lot more room on my screen for painting and placing my canvas. I can keep some commonly used things in palette drawers and up in the enhanced properties bar, and that keeps my screen free. So if you're interested in checking out the palette drawers, those are available under Window, palette drawers, and there's several presets created here, and then if you've created any yourself, those will be listed here as well. If they have a check next to them, that means they're showing. If they don't have a check next to them, that means that they're hidden for now. Now, while we're looking here under the window menu, let's also take a look at layout because we have these 9 new or updated layouts. And these layouts are going to set up your workspace in a particular way They're going to show and hide different things, and that'll help streamline your painting experience for particular tasks. For example, we have Classic, and Classic does not include palette drawer, so this is kind of the original version of Painter, and if you find that you don't like the way that painters change and you don't like the palette drawers, just select Classic and that'll put it back to what you're used to. There's New to Painter, which shows you the hints for all the different features, and it gives you the brush selector so that you can quickly experiment with brushes. There's Simple, which is kind of a very basic minimal workspace. There's Concept Art, which is useful for making concept art. There's one for illustration, fine art, photo art, and manga art. So you can feel free to experiment with these different layouts. You can also customize each of these to personalize them a bit. Just make sure that if you customize anything, go to Save Layout to save your changes. Otherwise, if you customize the Simple workspace or any of these other ones, and then you made some changes and you click back on Simple again, it'll reset it to that Simple default. So make sure you save your layouts if you change them. You can also do what I do and just save your workspace, which is a lot easier because saving your workspace will save everything. You can do that by going to Export Workspace. It might also be useful to set this up for Quick Switch, and you can actually have two different layouts that you can quickly toggle between. So let's say maybe I have a simple version and then the default version, and I want to quickly switch between those. You can do that here from the menu, or you can actually link that to a keyboard shortcut key. You'll go to Edit Preferences, Customize Keys, then you'll look under Window and Layout, and then Quick Switch, and then you would set that keyboard shortcut for Toggle Layout. Then when you hit that key, it'll toggle between those two different layouts. The next thing you might notice is something new on the toolbar, and that is the Interactive Gradient tool. The Interactive Gradient tool is a very useful tool for creating things like skies and backgrounds and masking and lighting effects, three-dimensional objects. It's a really awesome tool. So let's go ahead and click on it. Before we draw our gradient, we'll want to choose some colors for a gradient, and we can do that in a couple different ways. We can click up here on Preset, and we can choose a preset if we like any of these. I'm just going to go ahead and stick with the default, which is main to additional color. Your main color is this foreground dot here in the color picker. Your additional color is the background dot. You have to click on each of these to switch back and forth between them. So I'm going to go ahead and choose blue, and then I'll choose maybe this more magenta color. Now I'm going to go ahead and drag a gradient in any direction, and it creates the gradient in that direction. So if I want a vertical gradient, I go straight down. If I want a horizontal one, I'll go across. Now you'll notice we have this dashed line with two boxes on either side. These boxes are called nodes, and they represent each stop or each swatch in the gradient. So right now the gradient's going from this magenta to the blue. Click on our main color, and we could change that color to something else. Maybe we want it to be this lighter blue or maybe a green. If we want to add a color, we can click in the middle here to add a node, and then we can make that maybe a yellow color like this. We can move that node around. We can try different kinds of gradients like circular gradients, as you can see here, and spiral gradients, which are really interesting. You also have access to the composite methods here for the gradient and the opacity. You can choose whether or not you want to edit the nodes. If you just want to quickly draw the gradient, you can turn this off. Express Paint we'll look at in just a little bit. Then we have the check to commit or the X to cancel. Let's go ahead and just commit that gradient to apply it. You'll also notice in the properties bar we have a few new buttons here. We can choose how the gradient fills the canvas, if you want it to repeat or you just want it to be a single gradient. We also have options for the gradient. We can bring up the new Gradients palette drawer, which gives you access to gradients and gradient libraries, and the gradient node, which were the little squares on either end of the gradient. So I'm going to go ahead and clear that gradient and create a new layer here. I'm going to select just a regular linear gradient. Now, one important thing to note about the gradient tool is that if you're using it on a layer, that's fine. I'll draw a gradient here, but if I go to set my composite method up here in the properties bar, it's not going to do anything. What I would need to do is draw my gradient and then set the composite method of that layer here in the layers palette. Otherwise, if you want to control the composite method up here while you're drawing the gradient, you need to do that on a flat layer. You can see here if I do that on the canvas now, it's tinting over it. And I can go through the different composite methods like this. Now let's take a look at what Express Paint can do. I'm going to go ahead and draw a gradient, and I'm going to apply it, and then I'm going to select a blender, and I'm going to blend a little bit. And this is essentially what Express Paint is going to do, except it's going to do it quicker without you having to take out the blender and blend it yourself. So I'm going to undo that gradient. I'm going to go back to the Interactive Gradient tool. I'm going to draw my gradient. I'm going to go to Express Paint, and I'm going to choose one of these Express Paint effects. And these are different kinds of blending and brush strokes. Let's try jittery strokes. And then we'll also have to click Preview Effect. and you can see it's automatically blending a little bit. We can control the amount and the size if we want it to be bigger and we want it to blend more. And it gives you a nice blended sky effect. Let's try heavy dabs. Let's see what that does. It's a more extreme effect. Let's try soft dabs. And I think that looks good. I'll go ahead and click on the check to end that. So the Express Paint is a really nice way to turn a simple gradient into a nice painterly background. And just in case you were curious, the gradient tool does work inside of masks as well. As you can see, right now I have a gradient inside of a mask, and I can mask off part of this. I can switch it to a radial gradient, and you can make something kind of like a bubble effect. Now while we're on the toolbar, let's also take a look at the dropper tool because that's been enhanced a little bit. Now when you're sampling, you can change the sample point size. So if you want to sample a larger or smaller area, you can do that. So right now I'm on point sample, and if I sample and you look over here in the color picker, I'm getting exactly that area that I've clicked on. So it's not averaging out the area, it's not sampling a large area of color. But I can change that. I can increase that to, let's say, 101 by 101 pixel average. And now if I click, I'm getting an average of colors. So if I click over here where it's all pink, of course it's going to be pink, and down here where it's aqua, it's going to be all aqua. But if I click over here, even if I click exactly on this little green dot or exactly on this yellow dot, I'm still getting the average of the area that's being surrounded. So it's sampling maybe something like this rather than something like this. If I change the sample size back to point sample, now you can see if I click on the blue, I get blue. If I click on the yellow, I get yellow. And if I click on the green, I get green. But if I click around it, I get whatever pixel color I've selected. Now, one thing that I find extremely handy about this upgrade to the dropper tool is that now I can go in and I can create overlays. Let's say I want to put this overlay layer over everything and tint it a little bit. I can now go to my color sampler tool, or I can hold Alt to sample. And I can sample the color that I see on screen here, which is the combination of colors from all of the layers. Or rather than sampling all visible layers up here at the top, I can now sample selected layers. So let's say I want to choose this layer 1, which is underneath the color tinting. Maybe I want to know what the color was in the background before I put that tinting layer over it. And you can see here in this area, this orange area, it looks orange on screen, but the color I'm getting is a screen. If I hide that overlay, you can see that's the color underneath. That's extremely handy to me because I'll paint a lot of things in grayscale and then I'll add layers on top to tint it like I'm doing here. And I may want to go in and do a little painting behind this layer. And in previous versions of Painter, I'd have to go ahead and hide that layer so that I wasn't seeing it, sample the color I wanted, and then turn the layer back on again, which adds a lot of unnecessary time to my workflow. Now I can simply just choose selected layers, click the layer I want to sample it really quick. And if I wanted to work back and forth between these different grayscale colors, I can sample these behind that tint that's on top of it. The magnifier tool has also been enhanced. There's more levels of zoom now, so you can see that I can zoom in smaller increments than I could in previous versions of Painter. Another new change that I like involves layers. I use a lot of layers, and so I'll do things like add a highlight to the nose layer, and maybe add a nostril on a separate layer just so I have a little more control over my layers. But in earlier versions of Painter, when you merge layers together, you end up with the name of the topmost layer. And that's usually not what I want because in the hierarchy, the bottommost layer, a lot of the time, is a dominant name in the object. So nostril and highlight are an accessory to the nose, but the nose is kind of the main layer here. So what's nice now is that I can hit Control E with a layer selected, and that selected layer will merge down with the layer beneath it, and it will keep the name of the bottommost layer. So if I merge these layers down really quickly, I've just merged all of my nose layers together into a single layer, and I ended up with a layer name that I wanted rather than having to go in and change it back because it got replaced with something else. It's a small feature, but again, it really improves my workflow. The next enhancement that we'll look at deals with the brush selector. This is the brush selector here, and you'll notice that it looks a little bit different, but let's take a look at something else here. Let's go to Window, and we can now open Brush Selector Panel. And this brush selector can now be undocked. In previous versions of Painter, it was fixed here and it would disappear after you clicked away. Now you can open it, you can resize it, you can customize it in a few different ways. You have very quick access to all of your libraries. The libraries contain legacy brushes, so if there's older brushes that you were looking for in 2016 or 2015, that's where they're hiding. You can also see all of your most recently used brushes here, which is very handy. And of course, you have access to all of your categories and all of the variants within the categories. So now it makes it really easy to go in here experiment. You can try the dry palette knife, or the oily bristle, or the real oil short. If you've used any previous version of Painter, you know exactly what it's like to pick your brush and then have to click back up here again, pick another brush, click back up here, pick another brush. It's very time consuming. Now you can just get to all these brushes and experiment really quickly just to see what all the different brushes do. Up here in the top right subdialog, you have access to all of the brush commands. You can also choose the way the categories are displayed as well as the variants. And that can be really handy for a lot of people who are having trouble managing brushes before. And if you wanted to, you can incorporate this brush selector into a palette drawer just by clicking on the gear, or you can drag it into a pre-existing palette drawer if you like by dragging it from the tab here. And then I could put it in any one of these panels here. So now let's get down to the meaty part of this video and let's take a look at the new brush technology. There are a few new categories: dab stencils, glazing, and then texture cover and texture source blending. And these are three basic categories of brushes called glazing, dab stencils, and texture. Let's go ahead and start with glazing. I'm going to choose a brush called flat, and I'm going to choose blue. And glazing is a term used in traditional painting, and it describes a method of painting where a painter will use something to thin out their paint so that you can see through it partially, or they'll use a translucent or semi-opaque paint to paint over something and give it a little bit of a tint. So I can do that here. As you can see, I'm lightly glazing, and as I paint, the glaze builds up heavier and heavier. I can control that glaze with my pen pressure as well. If I press down lightly, I get a very thin glaze. If I press down firmly, I get a very thick glaze, and I can vary that back and forth very easily. If I pick another color, I can glaze over that glaze with another color and kind of blend these colors together, but it gives you a much more natural color blending. In previous versions of Painter, you had control over your opacity, but it ended up overlapping on itself and it didn't look natural like it does here. If you've used Photoshop or some other digital art applications, you may have noticed that this feature is pretty common in those applications. So if you're looking to move from Photoshop to Painter, you'll feel right at home with these glazing brushes. Let's take a look at some of the other glazing brushes. You can connect the glazing technology to the particle brushes if you like. You can connect it to real bristle and all kinds of other technologies. And see how easily I can tint over everything and then just build up those tints gradually. Now there's more to glazing than just this. We can also look in the glazing panel, which we have accessible here. We can pop that open, and we have control over the merge modes while we paint. This is very similar to stroke attributes, but it works a lot better. Right now the merge mode is set to gel, and so it's kind of blending with the layer in a certain way while I paint. Maybe I want to glaze with something and make it lighter. Now all of a sudden I have this glazing brush that builds up lighter and lighter each time I paint. I'll change to a lighter color and you can see it's building up kind of like a glow brush would. If I paint over here in the darker area, it builds up as I add more and more paint. If I set the merge mode to multiply and I paint with that same color, now it's tinting it darker and darker. We could even try difference. Difference is going to invert the colors. So now you can see anywhere I paint, it's inverting the colors back and forth. We could try color, and if I just want to tint everything one single color, I can gradually tint it by painting over it more and more. So in a practical sense, you could select normal, you could select a green color like this, and maybe you would want to paint a quick tree, and without changing your color, just change your merge mode first to multiply. Haven't changed my color at all, yet my color is darker because I'm glazing with a multiply merge mode. So each time I paint, I'm getting a darker and darker shadow, which helps my tree look more three-dimensional. Still not going to change my color, just going to change the merge mode, and I'm going to change it to screen this time. And you can see that it's adding the highlight to my tree as I'm painting over it more and more. So really quickly, I can get this nice three-dimensional paint without having to go in and change my color. So it gives you a lot more control over your glazing. If you open your general brush controls, you can access glazing as a stroke type. So if you want to experiment with adding glazing to any of your pre-existing brushes, you can do that here. I really like these glazing brushes a lot. They feel very smooth, and they feel a lot like how it feels when you're painting with something like acrylics in the way that they kind of blend and turn into opacity here. Let's take a look at the next brush technology, and those are the Dab Stencil brushes. Now it's important to note that Dab Stencil's glazing and texture can all be combined in different ways. So you can have a Dab Stencil glazing brush that also creates texture. Let's go ahead and scroll up here to the top. Let's choose Flow Map Chalk for our first brush. Let's also look up here in the property bar for dab options. That gives us access to our Dab Stencil panel. We can also pop that out if we want it to be on screen by clicking here. I have mine grouped into a custom palette group that I created along with glazing and texture because I like them all to be together. So here's my Dab Stencil panel. This gives us quick access to our Dab Stencil, which currently is set to Flow Map. And if you've used Painter before, you're familiar with how papers work. Papers will kind of keep your paint within this paper shape and there'd be a little bit of a grain, kind of like if you took a piece of paper and you rubbed it with chalk on a sidewalk, you'd get that paper texture. Flow maps work similarly, but typically they work with wet media like watercolor, and the water flows into those shapes. Now we can use a paper, a flow map, or a texture, or a combination of these to stencil off the tip of our brush. So I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to make a really big chalk brush, and I'm going to paint with light pressure. And you'll start to see that stenciling effect appear. It's confining my chalk within that shape. So imagine this shape here that you see is on top of your brush and it's kind of masking out or concealing some of those shapes while you're painting. So normally this brush without a Dab Stencil, it would look like this when I paint. When I apply the Dab Stencil, it looks like this. There's a little bit of a stencil effect going on, so it's creating more texture. Now if I increase the size of that flow map, you'll start to see it become more apparent. See, that texture is a bit broader now. If I change it to something more obvious like the fine dots, now you can really see what it's doing. It's stenciling it off. If I turn that stencil off, now I'm not getting those dots. Turn the stencil back on, increase the size really big and paint. If I paint with light pressure, you can see those dots appearing there. Now I can combine these stencil dots with the basic paper as well, as long as that brush also uses grain. And so I could pick a paper grain, let's say this pebble board. And now if I paint, you can see that I'm getting both of those. I'm getting the dots from the flow map and the grain from the paper texture. So this gives me a lot of control over some really nice, really organic looking results. For example, I have this custom brush I created called Smooth Dab Knife. And I can get this nice palette knife effect. Let's choose something a little more appropriate. Let's try clouds for the flow map. And let's try Artist Rough Paper for the paper. And now you can see that I'm getting this nice palette knife effect with a lot of texture. And I can very easily go in here and just change these, increase them, decrease them in scale, change the contrast. And I really quickly get a lot of nice organic looking texture very easily. In older versions of Painter, when you'd use your papers or your flow maps, you end up with kind of a repetitive pattern. This improves upon that a lot and adds more randomness to your strokes, which I really appreciate. In addition to flow map and paper, you can also stencil with texture. I could select a texture here, and if I paint, you can see that I'm getting that texture. Now texture is the next type of brush, so we'll go ahead and pull up one of those. There's two categories. There's texture cover and texture source blending. Let's try texture cover first. Let's select the airbrush. We'll want to look in our textures palette, so we can get to those textures up here in the top in the properties bar. We can pop open the textures panel there. I have mine in my palette drawer here, and we can see what our texture looks like right now. We can also click on show texture, and that'll show how our texture is applied over our canvas. Now textures have a predefined size and it's not very big, so there's a chance that when you load your texture here, it's not going to cover your entire canvas. If that's the case, you'll need to transform your texture. You have these transform controls up here at the top. So we could, for instance, move and resize it. If I wanted to make it bigger or smaller, I can do that. So that way your texture is covering the area that you want to add texture to. And right now the texture that we're looking at is paint on a table. It's called desk paint. I'm going to hide that texture and I'm going to paint with the airbrush. And you can see what's going on here is it's kind of transferring that image and blending it in to the image that I'm working on here a little bit. So it's kind of fading it in. Let's switch to a different texture. Let's switch to gas. So I can bring in some of that and it's slowly blending it in together. Now typically you would use this for texturing 3D models. You could also use it for photo painting, but I think it's really cool to add to fine art because as you can see here, I get this really nice organic painterly looking effect by bringing in a little bit of texture. And I would do this in older versions of Painter, but it would require a lot more layers and a lot more time. Now I have this really handy feature where I can just have all my textures saved here that I like to use, select my texture brush, and go in and paint. And as I mentioned earlier, these Dab Stencil brushes can use the texture as the Dab Stencil. So for example, I could select maybe this brick wall texture. And now if I paint with this brush, you can see that brick wall pattern appearing. It's kind of faint. Maybe we could try a different color and we can see that better. See that brick wall texture? It's very subtle. Let's try a different texture. Let's try eyeshadow. And you can see that I'm getting that texture now. If I turn the Dab Stencil off, there's no texture at all other than that paper grain. And besides these presets here, you can also very easily add in your own textures. For example, here, let's say maybe I want to make this huge mess that I made here into a texture. I'll select it. I'll go to Capture Texture. I'll call it Messy. And now I have that as my texture. If I want to create a new document, select my brush, select Texture. I'm going to select that texture, and then I'll go in here and paint. And you can see that I'm getting that texture. You're seeing a little bit of brick there because I had the brick incorporated in the texture that I saved. Now I want to show you a few more things that textures can do. I've brought in an image here, and what if we want to add texture to an image? We can do that in a couple different ways. I'm going to select the texture cover brush, and as we looked at with the airbrush earlier, we can add the texture over the top of it like so, which kind of covers it up. But what if we don't want to cover it up? What if we just want to blend the texture into the image as if it were projecting onto it? What we can do is we can choose the other category, which is texture source blending. Let's choose soft. Now you can see when we paint, it's preserving most of the original colors from the original image, but it's adding in that texture. And the more I paint over it, the more it adds. Let's try one of the other textures. Let's try high tech and let's see what that does. You can see that it's keeping the original image, but adding a little bit of texture over it. And I can paint in lightly, just to add a little bit. In other areas, I can paint in darker and add in more. We can try some of these other brushes. We can try the stencils with the flow maps. So then we're getting kind of a more rocky texture and it's not so perfect. We can also add color while we're painting. Let's try stencil flow map color control. And now the color we have selected will get incorporated with that texture. So now I'm painting both the texture and the color that I selected, and I'm getting that stencil flow map effect. You can see that I can add a little bit of blue and make it blue here and there. So on their own, glazing, Dab Stencil, and textures are very powerful technologies, but the fact that you can combine them really makes Corel Painter 2017 an awesome program to work with. And as an artist who tries very hard to make his digital work look traditional, this new brush technology makes random and organic looking effects a breeze. Now before we go, I just want to mention that I really quickly breezed over the glazing, Dab Stencil, and texture brushes, but there's a lot more that they can do. By hovering over each of these bars here, it'll pop up a little note that'll tell you what each of these effects do. So I recommend you experiment with all of these new features because you can create some really awesome brushes. So there you go, that's an overview of some of the new features in Corel Painter 2017. If you found this information helpful, take a quick second to like this video. And if you're new to my channel, I'd love to have you subscribe. I have hundreds of free Corel Painter tutorials like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.